Ladies and gentlemen, we gather here today not to wage war against idleness, as if it were some foreign invader, but to confront a far more elusive adversary, one that dwells within the very chambers of our own psyche. Procrastination, you see, is not the absence of action, but the presence of divided will. It is the quiet rebellion of the unconscious against the demands of the conscious mind. Procrastination, that sly and universal specter haunting the halls of human endeavor, is rarely what it appears to be. On the surface, it masquerades as mere laziness, a simple lack of discipline, or perhaps a trivial preference for momentary comfort over labor. But to dismiss it so lightly is to commit a grave error, one that leaves the true roots of delay untouched, festering in the dark soil of the unconscious. The shadow, that elusive and often neglected aspect of the psyche, plays a far more profound role in procrastination than the conscious mind is willing to admit. When we postpone a task, we are not merely avoiding work. We are fleeing from something deeper, something unseen, something that stirs unease in the hidden chambers of the self. Consider the student who, despite his earnest intentions, cannot bring himself to open his books until the night before the exam. The rational mind scolds him. You are irresponsible, weak-willed, but the deeper truth is far more complex. His resistance is not born of apathy, but of fear of failure, fear of the judgment that may follow, fear of confronting the limits of his own ability. The shadow in its cunning way has convinced him that the pain of self-reproach after procrastination is preferable to the terror of discovering that he might not be as capable as he hopes. In this way, procrastination becomes a perverse defense mechanism, a psychic maneuver to avoid the vulnerability that accompanies genuine effort. The ego, ever protective of its fragile self-image, would rather suffer the guilt of delay than the blow to its pride that might come from trying and falling short. Yet the shadow's role in procrastination is not limited to fear of failure. It also manifests as a rebellion against imposed demands, a quiet revolt of the authentic self against tasks that feel alien, meaningless, or coercive. The modern worker who stares blankly at his computer screen, cycling through distractions rather than completing his report, is not simply lazy. He is, on some unconscious level, resisting the erosion of his autonomy. When the soul perceives its labor as externally enforced, devoid of personal meaning or creative engagement, it retaliates with inertia. The shadow whispers, "This is not yours. Why should you pour your life into what does not belong to you?" And so procrastination becomes a form of passive defiance, a refusal to participate in work that has not been inwardly claimed as one's own. This resistance is further compounded when the task at hand threatens to unearth buried aspects of the self. Writing, for instance, is a common arena of procrastination, not because it is inherently difficult, but because it demands confrontation with the inner world. To write is to dredge up thoughts, emotions, and memories that may have been carefully avoided. The blank page becomes a mirror, reflecting back the chaos or emptiness within, and the shadow, ever vigilant against such exposures, urges retreat. Do not look too closely, it warns. You may not like what you find. Thus the writer delays, not because he lacks skill, but because he fears the psychic material that writing will force him to face. Even more insidious is the shadow's ability to disguise procrastination as virtue. How often have you heard someone say, or perhaps said yourself, "I work better under pressure," as if this were a badge of honor rather than an admission of self-sabotage. This delusion allows the ego to maintain the illusion of control while surrendering to the shadow's agenda. The truth is that no one truly works better in a state of frantic last-minute desperation. They merely become more adept at suppressing the shadow's interference when consequences loom. The rush of adrenaline that accompanies a looming deadline temporarily overrides resistance, but it does not resolve it. The shadow remains, waiting to reassert itself the moment the pressure lifts. To dissolve procrastination, then, one must first acknowledge its psychological depth. It is not enough to employ superficial tricks, timers, rewards, or rigid schedules, though these may help. The real work is to bring the shadow into consciousness, to interrogate its motives, to understand what it protects and what it fears. When you notice yourself delaying, pause and ask, what am I truly avoiding? Is it the task itself or what the task represents? If it is fear of failure, then the solution is not to shame oneself into action, but to reframe failure as a necessary part of growth. If it is a loss of autonomy, then the task must be reclaimed, infused with personal meaning, or rejected altogether if it is truly alien to the self. And if it is the dread of inner confrontation, then one must cultivate the courage to face what lies beneath, to tolerate the discomfort of self-awareness, knowing that clarity, not avoidance, is the path to liberation. The shadow thrives in obscurity. It gains power when its workings go unnoticed, when procrastination is dismissed as a minor flaw rather than a symptom of deeper conflict. But when brought into the light of conscious examination, its influence wanes. The energy once spent resisting tasks becomes available for creation. The psyche, no longer divided against itself, begins to move with a newfound unity of purpose. This is not a one-time effort, but an ongoing dialogue, a negotiation between the conscious will and the unconscious resistance, a gradual integration of the shadow's wisdom without yielding to its sabotage. Procrastination, in the end, is not the enemy. It is a messenger, a signal from the depths, urging you to look closer, to understand what your avoidance is trying to tell you. The tasks we delay are often the very ones that matter most, not because of their external importance, but because they call upon us to grow, to confront our limitations, to reclaim our agency, or to face the truths we have buried. The shadow knows this, even if we do not, and so it intervenes, not out of malice, but out of a twisted sense of protection. To stop procrastinating, then, is not to defeat a foe, but to listen, to decipher the unconscious logic of delay, and in doing so, to reclaim the fragmented parts of the self that have been exiled in the name of temporary comfort. The human mind, in its ceaseless dance between focus and fragmentation, has always wrestled with distraction, but never before has distraction worn such beguiling masks. Where ancient temptations were finite, the lure of idle chat, the fleeting escape of wine or slumber, modernity has birthed something far more insidious, an endless digital phantasmagoria that hijacks our attention not through brute force, but through the sly seduction of the trickster archetype. This is no mere inconvenience of technology. It is a psychological coup, a colonization of consciousness by forces that understand our vulnerabilities better than we understand ourselves. The smartphone's glow, the social media scroll, the algorithmic whisper of just one more. These are not tools we use, but psychic entities that use us, feeding on our neurological hunger for novelty while starving our capacity for depth. At the heart of this dynamic lies the trickster, that primordial archetype who lives in the liminal spaces between order and chaos. In myths, the trickster crosses boundaries, breaks taboos, and revels in disruption. Loki's schemes, Coyote's mischief, Hermes's thievery. Today, the trickster has migrated from folklore to feed streams, disguising itself as liberation while quietly eroding autonomy. Each notification is a tiny boundary violation, a micro-betrayal of our intention. The genius of these distractions lies in their mimicry of meaning. They offer the illusion of connection, the pretense of productivity, the simulation of stimulation, all while systematically dismantling our ability to engage in sustained thought. We click, swipe, and tap in a ritual of false participation, mistaking the interface for the world, the signal for the substance. Neuroscience reveals the grim mechanics behind this hijacking. Dopamine, that ancient motivator wired to reward survival behaviors, now fires at the ping of a like or the refresh of a feed. But this is no natural rhythm. It is a carefully engineered exploitation of our reward pathways, turning intermittent reinforcement into a weapon of mass distraction. The mind, evolved to prioritize novelty for survival, cannot help but respond to these digital bright objects, even as our higher selves recoil at the time lost. Herein lies the trickster's cruel joke. It convinces us we are satisfying deep needs while actually preventing their fulfillment. The social connection we crave becomes emojis without empathy. The knowledge we seek becomes headlines without understanding. The rest we require becomes zoning out without renewal. Yet to blame the technology alone is to miss the psychological symbiosis at work. The trickster archetype thrives because it answers in twisted fashion a spiritual hunger of our age. In a world where meaning has been flattened into metrics and human rhythms replaced by machine efficiency, distraction offers a perverse rebellion. When we scroll mindlessly, Part of us is resisting the unbearable weight of empty productivity, the soul-numbing grind of tasks stripped of transcendence. The shadow finds common cause with the trickster here. Both would rather burn down the prison of meaningless labor than endure it. This is why traditional time management techniques so often fail. They address the symptom of distraction while ignoring the disease, a life insufficiently aligned with the self. The solution, then, cannot be mere willpower any more than one could stop a tsunami with bare hands. We must first recognize distraction for what it is, not personal failing, but archetypal warfare. The battle is not between us and our phones, but between different levels of our own psyche, the shallow novelty-seeking layers versus the depth-craving self. To regain focus, we must change the terms of engagement. This begins with ruthless honesty about what these distractions provide. Anesthesia for existential discomfort, counterfeit communion for our isolated selves, the adrenaline of full urgency where real purpose is lacking. Ritual becomes our counter-magic, where the trickster thrives in boundary violations. We erect Seger boundaries, not with the rigidity of suppression, but with the wisdom of containment. The same archetypal energy that fuels distraction can be harnessed for focus if we imbue our work with the qualities the trickster falsely promises: playfulness, novelty, rebellion. A writer might trick herself into drafting a page by framing it as transgression against her inner critic. A programmer might approach code as a puzzle to outwit rather than labor to endure. This is the alchemical move, not to reject the trickster, but to redirect its energy upward, transforming compulsive distraction into creative flow. The environment itself must be reshaped as a temple against intrusions. Just as medieval cathedrals used architecture to direct attention heavenward, our workspaces must be designed to minimize the trickster's entry points. This goes beyond app blockers. It requires rethinking the very geometry of attention. What if we treated focus as a sacred space where the profane, endless notifications, multitasking is barred entry? The physical act of lighting a candle before work, of clearing the desk to a monastic simplicity, of donning noise-canceling headphones like ceremonial garb. These are not superstitions, but psychological triggers signaling to the unconscious now. We descend into the depths. Ultimately, the war against distraction is a war for the soul of our attention, that most precious and violated resource. The trickster cannot be eliminated, nor should we want to. Its energy is vital for creativity and adaptation. But like any archetype, it must be made conscious, negotiated with, and given appropriate channels. When we understand that our compulsion to check devices mirrors ancient divination rituals, seeking meaning in random patterns, we can redirect that impulse toward truer sources of revelation. The scroll thirst is at bottom, a thirst for the numinous. The challenge is to satisfy it with something real. Focus in our age, therefore, becomes an initiatory ordeal, a modern-day hero's journey where we must outwit the digital tricksters that would keep us in shallow waters. The reward is not just productivity, but the rediscovery of our own minds, the capacity to think in unbroken lines, to dwell in ideas without fleeing, to once again hear the whisper of our deeper selves beneath the static of the age. This is no small thing. In a world where attention is the new currency, the ability to focus is not just practical, it is a revolutionary act of psychic sovereignty, a reclaiming of the inner sanctum from forces that would turn consciousness into just another commodified stream. The path to true focus is not forged through the crude imposition of discipline upon an unwilling psyche, but rather through a sacred alchemy that transforms the very nature of work itself, from external imposition to inner necessity. What we call discipline is too often misunderstood as a kind of self-violence, a grinding of the will against resistance, when in its highest form it represents instead the harmonious alignment of conscious intention with the deeper currents of the self. The ancient alchemists sought to turn base metals into gold, not through force, but through patient participation in natural processes, and so it is with the cultivation of focused attention. When we approach our work as merely external obligation, we create an inner schism where part of the psyche inevitably rebels. But when we discover how that same work serves the unfolding of our own becoming, what was once burdensome becomes the vehicle of our liberation. This transformation requires what might be called a ritual approach to labor, where the act of focusing is imbued with symbolic weight, beyond its practical utility. Consider how religious traditions throughout history have framed even mundane activities as sacred when performed with proper intention. The Zen art of arranging flowers, the Benedictine motto of ora et labora, pray, the Kabbalistic understanding of everyday actions as repairing the world. Modern psychology confirms what these traditions long understood, that the mind responds profoundly to the meaning we assign to our actions. When we approach our work mechanically as mere means to an end, the unconscious withholds its full participation, but when we consecrate it as part of our individuation journey, the entire psyche mobilizes in service of the task. The resistance we feel toward difficult work often stems not from the work itself, but from our perception of it as something alien to our true nature. The artist who struggles to begin painting until she remembers that through this act, she participates in the eternal human impulse to create. She then finds the resistance melting away. The student who frames his study not as rote memorization, but as joining the great conversation of minds across centuries, accesses wells of motivation previously untapped. This is the secret that lies at the heart of all genuine productivity. That focus cannot be sustained when the work is seen as separate from the self, but becomes effortless when recognized as an expression of the self's unfolding potential. Modernity's great error regarding discipline has been its reduction of the concept to mere external control, stripping away its connection to virtue and self-actualization. The original meaning of discipline shares its root with disciple, implying not harsh self-punishment, but rather devoted following of a path toward mastery. When we recover this understanding, discipline ceases to be something we impose upon ourselves and becomes instead something we cultivate within ourselves, like a gardener tending precious shoots. The Latin discipline encompassed both instruction and the way of life that resulted from it, suggesting that true discipline is not about forcing behavior, but about shaping character through consistent practice aligned with purpose. The neurological dimension of this process reveals its profound psychological truth. When we repeatedly engage in focused work that we perceive as meaningful, we strengthen not just our willpower muscle, but more importantly, the neural pathways that associate effort with reward at the deepest level. The basal ganglia, those ancient structures governing habit formation, gradually reconfigure to expect satisfaction from concentration rather than distraction. This is why superficial productivity hacks so often fail. They attempt to manipulate surface behavior without addressing the underlying psychic economy that determines what the mind perceives is worth pursuing. Lasting change requires nothing less than a recalibration of our motivational hierarchy, a rewiring of our reward system to find pleasure in depth rather than novelty. The role of suffering in this process must be properly understood. There is indeed a necessary discomfort in the early stages of cultivating focus, but this is not the suffering of self-betrayal. It is the growing pains of psychic expansion. Just as the athlete experiences muscular discomfort when pushing beyond previous limits, the mind experiences resistance when stretching into new capacities for sustained attention. The crucial distinction lies in whether this discomfort is endured in service of one's authentic development or merely to meet external expectations. The former strengthens the self, the latter depletes it. At the collective level, our crisis of attention reflects a spiritual malaise. In a culture that values productivity over meaning, speed over depth, and consumption over creation, the very act of sustained focus becomes a quiet rebellion. To devote hours to single-minded work on something that may not yield immediate practical rewards is to reject the dominant values of our time. This is why the recovery of focus cannot be achieved through mere technique. It requires nothing less than a reorientation of one's entire way of being in the world, a conscious choosing of depth in an age that incentivizes skimming the surface. The alchemical transformation of discipline from external imposition to inner necessity follows a predictable though often difficult progression. First comes the recognition that our current patterns of distraction serve some psychological function, whether numbing anxiety, providing false comfort, or protecting fragile self-esteem. Next must come the courageous confrontation with what we're truly avoiding in our distraction, the fears, vulnerabilities, or unresolved conflicts that make aimless scrolling feel safer than purposeful engagement. Then follows the gradual reassociation of focused work with self-discovery rather than self-punishment, until finally the mind begins to crave depth as naturally as it once craved distraction. This transformation is never complete. The lure of the shallow remains ever present, and the discipline required is not one of perfect control, but of continual return, like meditation, where the practice lies not in maintaining perfect focus, but in repeatedly bringing attention back when it wanders. The art of sustained work is less about never getting distracted than about shortening the distance between distraction and return. Each act of refocusing is not a failure, but a strengthening, another repetition in the training of attention, another small victory in the reclamation of one's mind from the forces that would scatter it. The rewards of this practice extend far beyond mere productivity. As focus deepens, one begins to experience what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi termed flow, that state of complete absorption where time seems to alter its passage, and the self expands to meet its work. But more than this, there emerges a quiet but unshakable confidence that comes from knowing one can direct and sustain attention at will, what the ancients might have called a kind of inner sovereignty. In a world where attention is the most valuable and most violated resource, this ability constitutes nothing less than a form of psychological freedom. The phenomenon of synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that seem to defy mere chance, holds a profound key to understanding why action, even in its smallest increments, possesses such transformative power over procrastination. When we examine the psychological mechanics behind momentum, we uncover not just a practical strategy for productivity, but a fundamental principle of how the human psyche engages with reality itself. The first step, so often mythologized as the most difficult, actually serves as a kind of psychic initiation, a threshold crossing that activates unseen forces within and without. This is no mere motivational platitude, but observable psychological alchemy. By taking concrete action, however modest, we send a signal to both our unconscious mind and the external world that we are ready to participate in a new pattern of being. The universe, in its mysterious responsiveness, begins arranging circumstances in ways that support this declaration of intent. This dynamic operates according to what might be called the principle of psychological gravity. Once motion begins, it naturally attracts further opportunities for continuation. The writer who commits a single sentence to paper suddenly finds ideas flowing where before there was only blockage. The entrepreneur who makes that first phone call discovers unexpected connections materializing. The student who opens her textbook stumbles upon precisely the information needed. These are not magical occurrences, but evidence of how action alters our perceptual filters, what psychologists term selective attention, making us newly aware of resources and possibilities that were present all along, but invisible to the passive observer. The unconscious mind, once engaged through initial action, begins working as an ally rather than an obstacle, scanning the environment for relevant information and generating solutions below the threshold of awareness. Modern neuroscience reveals the biological underpinnings of this phenomenon. Action triggers the release of dopamine, not the fleeting spikes produced by digital distractions, but the sustained elevation associated with meaningful pursuit. This neurochemical shift creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Action begets motivation, which begets further action. The basal ganglia, that ancient brain region governing habit formation, begins encoding this new pattern, making subsequent actions progressively easier to initiate. What begins as conscious effort gradually transitions into automatic behavior, the psychological equivalent of a snowball gathering mass as it rolls downhill. The procrastinator waiting for motivation has misunderstood the causal sequence. Motivation does not precede action, but emerges from it, often unpredictably and sometimes explosively once the initial resistance is overcome. The shadow aspect of this truth manifests in procrastination's vicious circle. Delay leads to anxiety, which leads to further delay. Just as positive action generates its own supported momentum, so too does inaction breed conditions favorable to its own perpetuation. The unconscious mind, taking its cues from behavior rather than intention, interprets procrastination as evidence that the avoided task must indeed be threatening. Why else would we avoid it? And thus amplifies resistance through heightened anxiety. This explains why tasks we delay often loom larger in our imagination than in reality. The mental energy expended in avoidance frequently exceeds what the task itself would require, creating a kind of psychological debt where interest compounds daily. Synchronicity enters this equation through what Jung identified as the acausal connecting principle, meaningful flucidences, that arise when inner psychological readiness meets outer circumstance. The individual who takes action enters a state of heightened receptivity to these connections, while the chronic procrastinator remains closed to them. This is not mystical thinking but observable psychology. When we commit to a course of action, we unconsciously begin noticing and remembering information relevant to that pursuit, while filtering out irrelevant data. The world appears to respond to our efforts because our perception has become selectively attuned. What was always present now becomes visible. The student researching a topic suddenly sees relevant references everywhere. The entrepreneur networking finds helpful contacts appearing as if by chance. This perceptual shift creates the illusion or perhaps the reality of the universe conspiring to assist, when in truth our mind has simply awakened to possibilities previously ignored. The relationship between small actions and large outcomes follows nonlinear dynamics familiar from chaos theory, where minute variations in initial conditions produce dramatically different results, the so-called butterfly effect. Applied to habit formation, this explains why trivial-seeming starting points can lead to profound transformations. The daily writing of 3 sentences seems significant until it produces a manuscript. The 5 minutes of language study appears pointless until conversation becomes possible. The short walks feel inadequate until fitness is achieved. These small actions serve as strange attractors around which larger patterns self-organize, their power residing not in their immediate impact but in their ability to establish new trajectories that compound over time. The psychological resistance to starting stems in part from our brain's tendency to overestimate the difficulty of tasks while underestimating our capacity to handle them, a cognitive distortion known as the planning fallacy. Action serves as the corrective to this miscalibration, proving through direct experience that the anticipated discomfort was exaggerated. Each completed action builds what psychologist Albert Bandura termed self-efficacy, the belief in one's ability to execute necessary behaviors. This explains why chronic procrastinators often report feeling like different people once they begin working. The anxious avoidance state and the engaged flow state represent near total shifts in self-perception and capability assessment. The transformation occurs not through thinking about change, but through acting into it, demonstrating to the psyche that feared consequences rarely materialize as catastrophically as imagined. The temporal dimension of momentum reveals another psychological truth. Action collapses the artificial separation between present and future selves that enables procrastination. The procrastinator often operates with what behavioral economists call time inconsistency, valuing immediate comfort over future benefits due to perceiving the future self as essentially a different person. Action bridges this dissociation by making the future consequence feel immediately real. When we begin a task, we no longer imagine doing it, but actually experience doing it, collapsing the mental division that allowed delay. This explains why the just start advice proves so effective despite its apparent simplicity. It bypasses resistance by shifting focus from decision to action, from contemplation to embodiment. The collective aspect of this phenomenon manifests in what sociologists term social contagion, the tendency for behaviors to spread through networks. Action inspires further action, not just within the individual, but across groups. The team member who begins working motivates others through observable example. The writer who shares daily progress creates accountability and expectation. This social dimension adds another layer to momentum's power, as the energy of multiple participants creates a field that sustains individual effort. Procrastination similarly spreads through inaction, the silent collusion of mutual delay that often grips groups avoiding difficult tasks. Recognizing this interpersonal dynamic allows us to harness social forces for positive momentum rather than remaining victim to collective stagnation. At its deepest level, the principle that action generates meaning reflects an existential truth about human psychology. We discover purpose through engagement rather than through contemplation alone. The procrastinator waiting for perfect clarity before acting inverts the natural order. Clarity emerges most reliably from the process of acting itself. This explains why so many creative breakthroughs occur during work rather than before it, why solutions appear when we're immersed in problems rather than when we're avoiding them. The mind evolved to solve problems through interaction with the environment, not through isolated speculation. Action creates the conditions for insight by providing the raw material of experience from which understanding crystallizes. The neurological basis for this lies in the brain's predictive coding mechanisms, Our cognitive apparatus constantly adjusts its models of reality based on sensory input. Without action, these models remain untested and abstract. With action, they confront reality's feedback, forcing useful updates. This is why procrastinators often feel stuck in vague unease, while those taking action experience clearer, if sometimes painful, focus. The very act of doing provides the data needed for course correction. Perfectionism, that frequent companion of procrastination, withers under action's demands, forced to reconcile with the messy reality where all meaningful work actually occurs. The relationship between action and self-concept forms another vital dimension of this dynamic. We come to know ourselves not through introspection alone, but through observing our own behavior across time. The procrastinator who only intends suffers a kind of identity erosion, the gap between aspiration and action, creating cognitive dissonance that undermines self-trust. Each instance of following through on intention, however small, repairs this fracture, rebuilding the foundation of self from which larger accomplishments become possible. This explains why consistent small actions often produce greater long-term results than sporadic grand efforts. They shape the doer even as they shape the work, creating the psychological infrastructure for sustained achievement. The energy dynamics of procrastination versus action follow thermodynamic principles. Systems tend toward inertia unless acted upon by external forces, yet once in motion tend to remain so. The psychological activation energy required to initiate action is always greater than that needed to continue it, explaining why starting feels disproportionately difficult. This also reveals why breaking tasks into micro-actions proves so effective. It reduces the required activation energy to manageable levels, allowing the natural self-sustaining properties of momentum to take hold. The clever strategist of habit formation works not against but with these psychological physics, minimizing initial resistance to harness the self-perpetuating energy that follows. The temporal distortion experienced during flow states, where time seems to alter its passage during deep engagement, provides another clue to action's transformative power. Procrastination exists in a kind of temporal illusion, where the avoided task never feels immediately urgent until deadlines force confrontation. Action collapses this artificial separation, bringing the future into the present through embodiment rather than anticipation. The actor exists in real time, while the procrastinator remains suspended between tenses, never fully present because never fully committed. This explains why taking action, even on unpleasant tasks, often brings unexpected relief. It resolves the cognitive load avoidance, freeing mental resources previously devoted to self-regulation and rationalization. The man who fights himself will tire. The man who integrates himself, who makes peace with his shadow, who silences the trickster's laughter, who treats focus as sacred labor, will find that procrastination was never his enemy, but a misguided protector. Now it is time to let it go.